These unhappy times call for the building up of plans that rest upon the forgotten, the unorganized, but the indispensable units of economic power. For plans like those of 1917 that build from the bottom up and not from the top down, that put their faith once more in the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid.
The forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid, referred to in Roosevelt's speech, is the man we all know. He is the common man, the man that drove America forward into the 20th century. He is the man that built this country, the man that mined the coal, built the roads and the railroads. He worked in the steel mills and the auto factories. And when America entered World War II, these were the men that answered their country's call. These men knew the value of hard work, but they also knew that work was more than having a job and making money. It's about dignity and respect. It was about providing for their family and making sure their children had a meal and a place to sleep at night. And these were the men that by 1932 were at their lowest point. As Franklin Roosevelt delivered this radio address, the American people had already been through the worst years of economic destruction and devastation this country had ever seen. The aftermath of the stock market crash in 1929 led to an economic fallout, and by 1932, GDP had been cut in half. 20% of all banks had collapsed, leading to millions of dollars of the people's money to be lost forever. 1/4 of the American workforce was unemployed, and economic relief appeared unattainable under the Hoover administration.
The 18th Amendment is doomed. I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
The New Deal that Roosevelt felt the country needed grew organically after his administration took power in 1932. As he stated, it is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something. Try they certainly did, as Roosevelt and Congress passed 16 new laws in his first 100 days and went on to pass over 40 new laws and agencies created by 1939. They were programs to put Americans back to work. The TVA, CCC, NRA, PWA, they provided jobs for the unemployed and brought back the relationship between man and his labor, brought back a sense of dignity that these men lost. As the New Deal's tentacles took hold onto American society throughout the 30s, it created a new vision of what government was and what it could do, and also what was possible of the collective within an industrial society. A new political order would rise, and a new America that looked vastly different from the country's first 150 years. Roosevelt easily won re-election in 1936 and the next two after that as well. For the first time in American history, a president broke the two-term precedent. But what was happening within America was much more than that. It was something new, and something that could not be fully understood until many years of retrospect. Roosevelt had built a lasting coalition, a new coalition that still gripped politics into the 21st century. As John Judas and Roy Texeira explain, there is a difference between a political strategy that secures a majority for a party in one or two elections and a strategy that leads to the kind of majority the Democrats enjoyed after 1932. To achieve that kind of enduring realignment, a party's approach to policy has to mesh with its approach to politics. It has to advance policies that actually benefit the constituencies that make up its majority. If it doesn't, key constituencies will eventually turn on it. Roosevelt and the Democrats were able to do just that. They aligned their politics with issues, and that provided benefits and security, which built one of the most lasting coalitions in American history. Roosevelt brought together Northeastern liberals, white Southerners, African Americans, and working-class labor unions. Americans from all walks of life, each with their own goals and ambitions, each with their own backgrounds and cultures, all shared a common bond. they all knew was that Democrats supported the common man. And with that, the New Deal coalition built by Roosevelt created a Democratic Party that was built and sustained through the working class of America. These were the men and women that gave them their loyalty, support, and votes, and which would shape America over the ensuing decades. Over the next 45 years, New Deal liberalism glued together through the New Deal coalition ushered in the new America of the 20th century. Keynesian economics would dominate political thought as the U.S. traversed through the Depression and the post-war world. In 1935, the Social Security Act was passed, along with the Housing Act of 1937, the GI Bill in 1944, and the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. The National Labor Relations Act was amended throughout the 40s and 50s to support labor disputes against management. In the 60s, Johnson's Great Society passed Medicare and Medicaid. In the 70s, price and wage controls were imposed as a means to combat inflation. These decades would later be known as the Golden Age of capitalism, as post-war prosperity depended on a truce between capitalist growth and democratic fairness. It even led to Milton Friedman conceding that, in one sense, we are all Keynesians now. These years felt that America had finally found a true balance between the regulatory state and laissez-faire capitalism. But the 1970s proved the eternal Keynesian optimist wrong. New Deal liberal policies were no match for the decade that brought economic malaise not seen since the 1930s. Oil shortages mixed with economic stagflation led Americans to begin to question their government's ability to steer a capitalist economy in the right direction. Richard Nixon, with his ever-astute inclinations, began to pull on the hearts of the working class and drove a wedge through the cracks of Roosevelt's once solid coalition. He sensed change within Southern whites and saw a political opportunity with anti-civil rights backlash. Republican political strategist Pat Buchanan famously stated, "The whole secret of politics is knowing who hates who." Nixon created an us versus them mentality of the silent majority against the college-educated liberals that were protesting the Vietnam War and, by extension, protesting what they believed America stood for. When Vietnam War protests sprung out in New York City, it was the working-class construction workers that violently attacked them as the police looked on. Nixon used this incident to his advantage as he courted blue-collar workers towards the Republican Party through cultural issues instead of economic ones. Nixon even invited union leaders to the White House, which presented him with a ceremonial hard hat. As the 1970s carried on, it appeared liberals had no answer for the ever-burdening economic issues plaguing the country. By 1979, year-over-year inflation was at 11%. By 1980, it was at 13%.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. It is time to reawaken this industrial giant, to get government back within its means, and to lighten our punitive tax burden. And these will be our first priorities, and on these principles there will be no compromise.
Good evening. The polls are still open in many parts of the country. Votes are already being counted in some others. And in 3 states where the polls now have closed, ABC News has the following projections. We project that Mr. Reagan has won in the state of New Hampshire. New Hampshire has 4 electoral votes. ABC News also projects that Mr. Reagan is the winner in Kentucky. Kentucky has 9 electoral votes. And in Indiana, where the polls have...
Out of this malaise of the 70s brought a new era of political changes that set the Democrats on a new path to recapture their past political dominance. Ronald Reagan ushered in a new era of politics that cast aside the regulatory state in exchange for a reimagined belief in laissez-faire capitalism. These changes soared Republicans to new successes with victories in presidential elections in 1980, 1984, and 1988. On the other side of the aisle, the Democrats began a fundamental shift in who they were and who they represented. They viewed themselves as uncompetitive, and in order to win, they needed to adapt and change. This change brought in a new party, one with a new direction and aims. It appealed to different Americans and built itself on a new coalition. This new coalition sought changes over time and eventually viewed the working class as expendable in exchange for women, college graduates, and young people with college degrees. Michigan State University political scientist Matt Grossman revealed that in every election between 1952 through at least 2004, the idea that the Democrats were the party of the working class was the electorate's strongest positive association with it. Conversely, the strongest negative association with the Republicans was that it was the party of big business and the rich. What had changed after 2004? Had the long arc of the Democratic Party's abandonment of the working class finally come to a point where reality met rhetoric? How in 2016 had the party of the working class go on to lose those constituents to a Republican Party that has always been pro-business and anti-labor?
We know big government does not have all the answers. We know there's not a program for every problem. We know and we have worked to give the American people a smaller, less bureaucratic government in Washington. And we have to give the American people one that lives within its means. The era of big government is over.
Bill Clinton emerged as the face of what were called the New Democrats, or Third-Way Democrats. This new brand of party attempted to broaden their appeal by bringing a more centralist message that focused on crime and social reform, globalization, and embracing neoliberalism. The rejection of Keynesian economics marked a sharp change from their traditional roots from the 30s and was displayed through their new relationship with Wall Street. Clinton decided to reject a pro-labor cabinet in exchange for a pro-business one. He brought on former Goldman Sachs executive Robert Rubin to serve as the Secretary of the Treasury under Clinton from 1995 to 1999. He was replaced by pro-Wall Street academic Larry Summers. The Democrats' new ties to Wall Street brought in more deregulatory gifts throughout the 90s. This led to a high-risk, high-reward tightrope walk into the new century. The Glass-Steagall Act, a Depression-era law that prohibited the merging of commercial and investment banks, was repealed in 1999. In 2000, the Commodity Futures Modernization Act passed, which allowed complex derivatives to be used for Wall Street transactions. Fueled by new deregulation and technological inventions, the 90s economy soared to new highs. But a shift back towards laissez-faire economics brought new risks to stability that would lurk beneath the surface for the next several years.
Confidence gets affected, and those memories of fear are coming back.
What the heck is going on down here? I don't know.
All of a sudden here, we started hearing screaming, buy, buy, buy.
Now broken Dow 10,000.
The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped more than 900 points.
As H.G. Wells said, we were making the future, and hardly any of us troubled to think what future we were making. Deregulation throughout the 90s and into the 2000s culminated in the Great Recession from 2007 to 2009. When the recession hit, the number of manufacturing jobs in the U.S. declined by over 2 million from the start of the recession in December 2007 to its end in June 2009. Barack Obama's message of hope and change didn't translate into reality as Americans' calls for serious banking regulations fell on deaf ears. Obama maintained the business-as-usual relationship with Wall Street and decided to bail them out, while also refusing to implement any real consequences for their reckless business practices and unregulated gambling, which left 15 million Americans unemployed and the world on the brink of economic collapse. All the while, Main Street homeowners received nothing except foreclosures and anger. 16 years of Wall Street coddling by Democrats' administrations changed people's perceptions of the party, which only worsened after 2008. The Democrats' embrace of globalization set in motion years of economic decline of the prosperity and livelihood of working-class Americans. As free trade became the Democrats' new mantra, the Democrats were quick to align themselves with policy positions started by Reagan and the Republicans back in the 1980s. It seemed logical to eliminate barriers with our neighbors.
In a few moments, I will sign the North American Free Trade Act into law. NAFTA will tear down trade barriers between our three nations. It will create the world's largest trade zone and create 200,000 jobs in this country by 1995 alone.
Grave concerns about NAFTA were raised by Americans' labor unions. The Economic Policy Institute, the labor-backed think tank, warned that NAFTA would widen the trade deficit with Mexico and lead to a net job loss, specifically in manufacturing. However, these predictions were countered by the Institute for International Economics, founded by billionaire investment banker Peter Peterson. Their conclusion said the deal would lead to billions of dollars in surplus and hundreds of thousands of jobs created. Clinton had already made his conclusions on what to believe before the deal was signed. When it was signed in 1993, the consequences better aligned with labor's initial concerns. The next 28 years saw a trade deficit with Mexico and a net loss of over 1 million jobs, 600,000 of those in manufacturing. 20 years later, the working class would never forget how the Democrats passed policies which told them their livelihoods were expendable in the name of globalization. When the debate over China's inclusion into the World Trade Organization began, Clinton took the opportunity to teach Americans of its benefits. In March 2000, Clinton called it the equivalent of a one-way street. It requires China to open its markets to both our products and services in unprecedented new ways. All we do is to agree to maintain the present success which China enjoys. We'll be able to export products without exporting jobs. He stated that by joining the WTO, China is not simply agreeing to import more of our product, it is agreeing to import one of democracy's most cherished values, economic freedom. In the end, Clinton got his wish. China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, but the promises made, once again, never seemed to materialize. Economic freedom never came to China, as so hopefully cheered on by Clinton, and to add insult to injury, an estimated 2.7 million American jobs were lost, 2 million in manufacturing between 2001 and 2011. The trade deficit with China totaled $349 billion by 2008.
And I have
Your
done
husband signed NAFTA, which was one of the worst things that ever happened to the manufacturing industry.
That is your opinion.
You go to New England, you go to Ohio, Pennsylvania, you go anywhere you want, Secretary Clinton, and you will see devastation where manufacturing is down 30, 40, sometimes 50%. NAFTA is the worst trade deal maybe ever signed anywhere, but certainly ever signed in this country. And now you want to approve Trans-Pacific Partnership. You were totally in favor of it. Then you heard what I was saying, how bad it is, and you said, I can't win that debate. But you know that if you did win, you would approve that, and that will be almost as bad as NAFTA. Nothing will ever top NAFTA.
That is just not accurate. I was against it once it was finally negotiated, and the terms...
As the 2024 election approaches, this process is far from concluded. Joe Biden has attempted to redirect the ship, claiming to be the most pro-union president since FDR. But actions always speak louder than words, as the Democrats not only have 40 years of policy issues, they also have an image issue. Working Americans are acutely aware that the last 40 years have not been kind to people like them. These glaring issues became apparent in 2016. Trump won 64% of all white non-college voters. It was a critical demographic that was largely responsible for his victory. But how sustainable really is a home in the Republican Party, a party that has always been pro-business? Are they capable of providing benefits to a labor constituent that they've always shown a general indifference towards? In 2020, Biden's share of white, non-college voters was 33%, an improvement upon Hillary Clinton's 28%. Can Biden expand on that? Or is Trump on the verge of a historic realignment of working-class voters that will fundamentally shift American political outcomes over the next several generations? Yet we must remember that working-class Americans are not a monolithic voting bloc. They come from all different backgrounds and places across the country. The romanticized image of them as hard-working men that reside in the Rust Belt is too simplistic. Of course, it is more complicated than that. A 2023 report from the Center for American Progress states that the top 3 working-class industries are construction, restaurants, and healthcare, and the top occupations are drivers, sales workers, and freight handlers. Shifting demographics has raised new questions about how do they fit into this two-party system. Some of these questions will be answered in November, and some of them over the next few years. But some of these questions may never be truly answered, as coalitions ever constantly rise and fall. However, one thing is certain: working Americans will always continue to search for a party that can give them the loyalty and respect they deserve.